The real reason your hair isn't growing back. Let's talk about something that most hair loss videos completely miss. And it might be the exact reason nothing you've tried has actually worked. If you're a man watching your hairline creep back, or a woman noticing that the crown of your head is getting thinner, this video is directly for you. Not because I'm going to throw another product at you, but because I want to explain what's actually happening beneath your scalp, and why so many popular remedies fall flat even when the science behind them is solid. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The problem isn't always the remedy. Sometimes the problem is a wall. There's a physical barrier blocking your hair growth. When we talk about pattern hair loss, the most common type affecting both men and women, a huge piece of the puzzle that almost nobody discusses is scar tissue. Not metaphorical scar tissue, actual, physical, fibrous scar tissue sitting right on top of your skull, acting like a locked door between your hair follicles and everything they need to survive. Now here's what makes this genuinely fascinating. Your hair follicles aren't dead. I know that sounds hard to believe if you've been bald or thinning for years, but stay with me. In 2024, researchers from the University of Virginia confirmed something remarkable. The stem cells responsible for generating new hair growth are still alive even in people who are completely bald. Completely. They're not gone. They haven't vanished. They're just dormant, sitting there in a kind of biological hibernation, waiting for a signal that never quite arrives. Think of it like microbes living in frozen winter soil. They're not dead. They're just waiting for the right conditions to wake up. So why aren't they waking up? Because the scar tissue is blocking the signals. It's blocking blood flow. It's blocking oxygen. It's blocking the nutrients those follicles desperately need. When researchers actually performed biopsies on people with pattern hair loss, they found that up to 70% of them had this exact situation. Fibrous, calcified tissue suffocating the follicle from the outside. This is why your rosemary oil might not be working. This is why topicals give you inconsistent results. The product might be fine. The problem is, it can't get through. What's causing the scar tissue in the first place? Scar tissue doesn't just appear randomly. It's the result of chronic inflammation. That inflammation creeps into the tiny blood vessels feeding your scalp, calcifies them over time, and slowly chokes off circulation to the follicle. Less blood flow means less oxygen, fewer nutrients, and follicles that have no choice but to go to sleep. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because inflammation itself has a root cause, and that root cause has a name most people in the hair loss conversation aren't talking about enough. DHT is the symptom, not the source. You've probably heard that DHT is the villain behind pattern hair loss. And it's partially true. DHT is a potent form of testosterone, and when it accumulates around the hair follicle, it can accelerate miniaturization and loss. But if you stop the investigation there, you're missing the deeper layer. The real root cause sitting underneath DHT is something called insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is what happens when your pancreas has been pumping out so much insulin for so long, usually in response to a high-carb, high-sugar diet, that your cells start ignoring it. They become resistant. Your insulin levels stay chronically elevated even when your blood sugar looks normal on a basic test. Now here's the hair follicle connection that changes everything. Hair follicles are uniquely dependent on glucose for their energy. Unlike many tissues in the body, they can't run on ketones or fat. They need glucose. So your first instinct might be, great, I'll just eat more carbs. But that's the exact opposite of what you want to do. Loading up on carbohydrates is precisely what drives insulin resistance higher, which means your follicles can't absorb that glucose no matter how much of it is circulating. It's like having a full refrigerator and a locked kitchen door. On top of that, insulin resistance does 3 other things that directly attack your hair. It constricts and slows blood supply to the follicle. It triggers systemic inflammation throughout the body. That inflammation activates the cells responsible for producing scar tissue. So the full chain looks like this. Poor diet leads to insulin resistance, leads to inflammation, leads to scar tissue, leads to dormant follicles, leads to hair loss. DHT is involved, yes, but it's accelerating a process that insulin resistance is fundamentally driving. This is why just taking a DHT blocker, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a natural supplement, often delivers disappointing results on its own. You're treating a downstream effect while the upstream cause keeps running. A case study that proves the point. In 2024, a case study was published that made me stop and pay attention. A man with classic pattern hair loss went in for testing. His fasting blood glucose? Completely normal, which is why most standard screenings would have flagged nothing. But his fasting insulin was extremely elevated. He also had a dark, velvety patch of skin on his neck, a classic and often overlooked sign of insulin resistance, sometimes associated with prediabetes. The doctors put him on a single medication targeting insulin resistance. No hair treatments, no topicals, no special shampoos, just correction of the underlying metabolic issue. Within 6 months, his hair came back. Now, I'm not here to recommend medication. There are effective natural approaches to addressing insulin resistance, and that's where I want to focus. But this case is a powerful illustration of something we can't ignore. Fix the metabolic environment, and the hair often follows. Step 1. Change the internal environment. The first step in this protocol is dietary, and it's non-negotiable. Go low-carb. The ketogenic diet, or a similar low-carbohydrate approach, dramatically reduces the insulin load on your body. When insulin levels come down, resistance begins to reverse, inflammation decreases, blood flow improves, and the conditions that have been strangling your follicles start to shift. Pair this with intermittent fasting. The reason this matters so much isn't just about weight or blood sugar. It's about triggering a biological process called autophagy. Autophagy is your body's internal recycling system. It breaks down and clears damaged proteins, dysfunctional cells, and metabolic debris. Crucially, research shows that autophagy can also help reactivate dormant stem cells, the same ones sitting dormant inside your follicles right now. One more thing before we move on. DHT itself is not the enemy. I want to be clear about this because some people, in their desperation to stop hair loss, go after DHT too aggressively. This hormone plays vital roles in your health: puberty development, libido, facial hair, and perhaps most importantly, it has significant anti-anxiety and mood-stabilizing effects. When people take pharmaceutical DHT blockers and suppress it too drastically, mood disorders and depression can follow. The goal isn't to eliminate DHT. The goal is to normalize it by addressing insulin resistance, and in doing so, DHT typically self-regulates to a healthier range. Step 2. Break down the physical barrier. Now for the part of this protocol that I think is the most underrated and the one that makes everything else actually work: microneedling. Before you click away, hear me out. This isn't a gimmick, and it doesn't have to be expensive. Dermarollers are widely available, affordable, and backed by a legitimate and growing body of research specifically in the context of hair loss. Here's the mechanism. When you roll tiny needles across your scalp, you create controlled micro-injuries in the skin. Your body responds to these injuries the way it always does, by initiating a healing cascade. And as part of that healing process, it breaks down old, damaged collagen, that is, the scar tissue that's been blocking your follicles, and replaces it with healthy, flexible tissue. More than that, it physically opens channels into the scalp, dramatically increasing the absorption of any topical remedy you apply afterward. Remember the wall we talked about at the beginning? This is how you start taking it down. Protocol specifics: needle depth, 1 to 1.5 millimeters, deep enough to trigger a healing response, shallow enough to stay safe. Frequency: once every 2 to 4 weeks. Your scalp needs time to heal between sessions. Do not apply topicals immediately after. Wait 24 to 48 hours to avoid irritation before putting anything on the treated area. Step 3. Feed the follicle through the open door. Once microneedling has opened up those pathways, You have a narrow but powerful window to get active ingredients deep into the scalp. This is when you bring in your topical treatments. The one I want to highlight first is topical melatonin, and not for the reason you're probably thinking. Most people associate melatonin with sleep, but melatonin is also one of the most potent antioxidants your body produces, and when applied directly to the scalp, research shows it has a meaningful effect on stimulating hair follicle activity. Apply it at night before bed, since it does promote drowsiness, ideally in the 24 to 48-hour window following your microneedling session. To amplify the results, you can layer in several other evidence-backed topicals. Rosemary oil has an impressive body of research behind it. In a head-to-head clinical trial with over 100 participants followed over 6 months, rosemary oil nearly matched the performance of minoxidil, Rogaine, without the side effects. That's not a small claim. Saw palmetto, topical, has been supported by 5 separate clinical trials showing positive outcomes for hair density and retention. Pumpkin seed oil, taken orally at around 400 milligrams per day, showed a 40% increase in hair density in one randomized controlled trial. The oral form works systemically, so it complements the topical approach rather than competing with it. A quick note on onion juice. In one clinical study, onion juice produced an extraordinary 87% hair regrowth rate. That sounds almost too good to be true, and the context matters. That trial was conducted on individuals with alopecia areata, an autoimmune form of hair loss, not pattern hair loss. If autoimmune hair loss is your situation, onion juice combined with microneedling is absolutely worth exploring. The reason it works so well is its exceptionally high content of quercetin, a flavonoid with powerful anti-inflammatory properties. But if you have standard androgenic/pattern hair loss, it's not your primary tool. Don't ignore the stress variable. There's one more factor worth addressing directly: cortisol. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, and elevated cortisol directly worsens insulin resistance. Many people notice significant hair shedding in the months following a stressful period, not necessarily during it, but after. The delay makes it easy to miss the connection. If stress is part of your picture, the most effective interventions are also the simplest. Daily walks, particularly outdoors, prioritizing sleep, and supplementing with vitamin B1, thiamine, which has a calming effect on the nervous system and helps buffer the physiological impact of cortisol. These aren't just nice-to-haves. Stress management is metabolic management, and if cortisol keeps driving insulin resistance, the rest of the protocol works against an uphill current. Putting it all together. The reason most hair loss approaches disappoint people isn't because the science is wrong. It's because they're targeting individual pieces of a much larger puzzle without addressing the whole picture. Here's the full framework. Internally, correct insulin resistance through a low-carb diet and intermittent fasting. Trigger autophagy to clear damaged tissue and reawaken dormant stem cells. Manage cortisol through sleep, movement, and stress reduction. Structurally, use microneedling every 2 to 4 weeks to physically break down the scar tissue barrier and open channels into the scalp. Topically, in the 24 to 48-hour post-needling window, apply topical melatonin, rosemary oil, and saw palmetto to feed and stimulate the now accessible follicles. Add oral pumpkin seed oil for systemic support. Your follicles are not gone. The stem cells are still there. The environment around them has simply become too hostile for them to function. Change the environment, internally and externally, and you give them a real chance to wake up. The next step is learning exactly how to implement a healthy version of low-carb eating with intermittent fasting in a way that's sustainable, because that foundation underpins everything else in this protocol. Start there and build from it.